Top tips for seed saving: only do the easy ones, because it just becomes a whole different skill if you're trying to save seed from things like brassicas or biennials. I mean, you know, if you've got the space and if you've got the time, do it, but it is very time consuming. It's a completely different skill set to just gardening. I used to think that, oh, one of the best things that I could do in terms of being self-sufficient or whatever is saving my own seed. And then when I read that you need about 40 kale plants to save true to type seed, plus they can't cross with any other type of that brassica, including all the wild varieties, I just thought, okay, there's no point doing this. You need mesh, you need to buy fly maggots for those to pollinate within the mesh. So what I actually prefer to do is, I think it's so important that we have access to high quality, organic, local seed suppliers, because as I said, it's a different skill in itself. We're very fortunate enough to have real seeds around an hour south down the road, down the coast. And real seeds is such a fantastic resource for us gardeners here in the UK for getting these interesting heritage varieties out into the garden. And so, yeah, I've actually been, as time progresses, I've been seed saving less and less, because I think by putting that investment into where I get my seeds from, and for most seed packets they'll last me 2 or 3 years anyway, I think that's a much better use of my time, because what self-sufficiency always comes down to is how much time do we actually have. I'd rather spend more time investing in creating fertility or compost or things like that versus trying to save seed. And if you've got a small garden as well, seed saving is going to take away vital space from producing food, which is probably your main priority. The biggest hidden cost of self-sufficiency, I mean, time would work, wouldn't it? Time is a cost. But I'd also say, compost. It's so easy, like how the cost of compost adds up over time. And so what I can hear is it's gonna start making a noise very soon. So compost has quite a hidden cost. I think that the best time to invest in a bunch of compost is whenever you're establishing a garden. If you're establishing a garden, you want to get off to a good start. Otherwise, it can be very demoralizing, not really getting much compost, and you're trying to just grow in topsoil or just a little bit of compost. There are ways of kind of doing that in stages, where the first year you could just focus on cover crops and make enough compost for the following year. But when you have a new space or an allotment, you're going to be really excited and you just want to get planting. And I get that. So one of the things that I've been a challenge myself, it's something that I've always been kind of contesting with and having my own inner debates, is approaching how I can grow food and produce the most amount of compost that I can. Because I got into the position couple of growing seasons back where I realised that at the start of every year I was ordering a few big builder sacks worth of compost on a yearly basis for the garden. And I thought, with the money that I'm spending for that, I could have just spent it on buying wholesale organic produce. Yes, I'm not going to have the joy or the fun of growing that, but if we're thinking about costs and again self-sufficiency and time, I thought, well, why am I buying all of this compost? It doesn't make sense to me. And so there's a few things that I'm changing over the next year or so. The secret garden, for example, the setup that we have in there that I can announce in about a week or two, that is 90% self-sufficient in homemade compost. So that there is a big win. Hold that thought. Coffee is brewing, important times. So, as I was saying, the secret garden, 90% self-sufficient in compost, using a few different methods. Now, I'm not talking about 90% self-sufficiency in terms of all of the nutrients. because I'm utilising resources here in our local landscape and from our local urban town to be able to bring in those nutrients, bring in those waste nutrients and turn them into goodness, to turn them into compost. It's just, there's so many benefits that you can enjoy from that process in between, for example, hotbeds. Now, one of the things that we're doing on this site is we're changing around a lot of things. We're having a much bigger emphasis on perennials, but we're changing one of the gardens to become just a garden for growing staples, you know, carrots, onions, potatoes, leeks, all of the good stuff. And my plan for that is to simply add seaweed, to mulch with seaweed every autumn or early winter, because we can access seaweed. And here from our local what's it called, a beach. Here from our local beach, we can just go after a storm with a couple of IKEA bags and just fill them with loose seaweed and mulch them. And I know, I've heard, this is where the idea came from, I've heard that apparently up in Scotland there's on some of the outer islands, the outer Hebrides, there's no trees there. And so it's like, where do you get that fertility from? Where do you get that organic matter? And so I've heard that they've just used seaweed to mulch their areas of where they're growing their potatoes year on year. And so I thought, well, we can do the exact same here. And that's 15 beds, 15 raised beds. And if I'm taking away the needs of compost and replacing it mainly with seaweed, that is quite a big saving. It's really important, maybe like next year, to have a year of calculating or just tracking how much compost you end up using. There's various different compost calculators, but also all of the receipts. And you can see how kind of the hidden cost of compost really does start to build up as the season progresses. And so I'm going to be exploring and sharing all of these different ways that I'm reducing compost costs, because I think for so many gardeners, if you can overcome that barrier of compost and producing enough compost to grow food, then I think you're laughing. Then I think that is, you know, one of the core skills of self-sufficiency cracked. The next one is being able to cook without following recipes, but more on that in a future video. I also know that one of the biggest luxuries is having access to space. And so many of you that watch this video, you just have a little back garden or maybe an allotment, maybe even a balcony, and you might be thinking, I don't want to take up any growing space whatsoever for making compost because I want to grow as much as possible. And at the end of the day, that's a decision. There's no right or wrong about it. I'm thinking purely from a cost-saving benefit, and also in terms of building as much resilience as possible within your own system. Sacrificing a bit of growing space for making enough compost to make you self-sufficient in compost, I think is always going to be better. And there's different ways of being able to utilize that. You know, you can plant a pumpkin plant in your compost bin. You could look at, if you're on a balcony, you could look at creating a worm compost, a vermicompost system. So you're processing all of your food scraps, but in a bucket. So there's always a way of doing it, and I think that is very empowering. So it's about looking at your garden, your needs, your goals, and finding the best way of producing compost that meets that space and the time that you have. You could just ask a comment down below with your situation, and maybe we can all help as well answer potential ways of producing compost and saving a huge amount of money. Well, if I had some copper, I could turn this into a magic wand and go bzzz, and it would actually make the coffee for me, probably, wouldn't it? I get sometimes, all right, I need to test this out myself, so just a slight disclaimer. You show me a thriving ecosystem where there's these random rods of wood with copper. I don't see that in the rainforests. I don't know, maybe there are, maybe they're very well hidden, but in nature you don't have these copper rods and you still have an absolutely thriving ecosystem. And I know that I've seen so many videos out there, some people swearing by it, other people saying makes no difference whatsoever. And so I think it's definitely too far out there for me. but I will test it. I'm very open to testing it. I can understand little parts of the theory behind it, but I think it is, again, I found myself, I was kind of going off on a bit of a tangent with all of my gardening, and I'm really bringing it back into trying to produce good, honest food that feeds people and is kind to nature and to the planet as possible. I think things like electroculture, a danger of it is putting people off. It's one of the problems that has occurred with permaculture, because it started from a very nice, pragmatic, practical approach. It's just simply a toolkit of design principles that anyone can use, but it's kind of been hijacked by various groups that have made it just way too out there for the general population. There's almost like a stereotype to like when you hear the word permaculture, and that has been very off-putting for people, because people on the edges who are thinking, oh, I'd like to grow food, very often they see the more extreme side of permaculture, and it's always the extreme sides that let down the actual method. Like I did that video about no dig, it's the extreme sides of some people about no dig that actually lets down the technique or the method or the approach in the first place. So that's why I think for most things, everything kind of like sits in the middle. We can take different ideas. Electroculture though, I can't stop laughing at it, that's the thing. I keep on hearing more and more things, and if it works for you, that's fine. I'm just being completely honest. So if you are a fan of electroculture, I've actually got, someone made me a wand, Sam, I've got to pick up someone's made me a wand out of some driftwood, and they were talking about different stones that will apparently help create a barrier or force field around the garden. So stay tuned for electroculture. But in the meantime, what is far more important for a productive garden is just enjoying the outside, having a coffee and dreaming about, well, I've got to plant some garlic next. Do you want some coffee, Sam?
Oh, lovely. Cheers.